The following program contains language and scenes that some viewers might find objectionable. Discretion in viewing is advised.
The call came in early on a November morning. The woman at the other end said she had a problem.
And what's the problem?
My grandson's not breathing right now.
Is he able to talk or cry at all?
No.
Is he making any sounds at all?
No, he's not. He's
Yeah.
very cold.
The ambulance is on the way.
Rescue teams assumed they were heading to an emergency. But when they arrived at the East Toronto address, nothing seemed right. No frantic relatives out front. No lights on inside. Their first knocks went unanswered. When someone finally did let them in, they were told to keep their voices down as they were directed to the kitchen in the back.
As soon as they entered the house, they immediately could smell the stench of urine throughout the home. It was just strange, just strange.
What the rescue teams were about to find in that kitchen was so strange, so shocking, it would leave a permanent mark on everyone involved. The emergency crews tried everything to revive Jeffrey that morning, but it was all too late.
It's the worst death of a child that I've ever seen.
Homicide detective Mike Davis.
Just the fact that he was so emaciated and his ribs were exposed. He had sores all over his body. He had the sunken eyes. He was cold, very cold to the touch. It appeared as if he had been dead for a while.
Not even the doctor who performed the autopsy could believe what he saw. Officially, Jeffrey died of bacterial pneumonia, the result of breathing in his own feces. But the real cause was severe, prolonged malnutrition. Simply put, in one of the world's richest cities, this 5-year-old had starved to death. The investigation as to why and who was responsible would raise serious questions about our system of child protection. Jeffrey started life healthy and strong. By all accounts, a happy baby, with 2 older sisters and a younger brother. Their parents, though, were troubled. There were accusations of violence and abuse. In the late 1990s, Yvonne Kidman and Richard Baldwin lost custody of their children. With the blessing of the Toronto Catholic Children's Aid Society, the CCAS, the children came to live here with Yvonne's mother and became part of an already crowded household. Elva Botno, her partner, Norman Kidman, their 2 other daughters and their families. In all, 6 kids and 6 adults in a tiny 3-bedroom house. For Jeffrey, it would be a house of horrors.
The police got there and started to take a good look at the house and the conditions of the home.
Mike Davis led the team that investigated Jeffrey's death.
They found on the 2nd floor, of course, this room. There was a lock on the door, and this room was very cold, had a high stench of feces. When the coroner had arrived, he had examined the cribs, and when he squeezed one of the mattresses, urine literally poured out of one of the mattresses.
No one yet knew what had happened in that house, but Catholic Children's Aid immediately seized the surviving children and sent them to a foster home.
We didn't know much about them. We knew names and ages.
For the next 3 years, this experienced foster mother cared for them. To protect the children's identities, we have obscured hers.
What was your reaction to these children when you first saw them?
It was pitiful. They were so shocked. They were shell-shocked. They were Their eyes were like sharks. They were dead almost. They didn't maintain eye contact for any length of time.
Coming from that other house to a suburb like this must have been shocking. And at first, the children were wary of everyone. But then they started opening up, and from their tiny mouths came a harrowing tale. Two of the children, the eldest and the youngest, were considered the good kids in the family and apparently led relatively normal lives. But for some reason, Jeffrey and his sister were singled out as the bad kids, and they were actively despised.
There was a family name for this child and her brother Jeffrey, and that was Pig.
Pig.
Pig. They asked me where the pig wall in my house was, or the pig room, and I had the children explain that, you know, there's a wall for the pigs to stand at. Where's the pig bowl that the children eat from?
Amazingly, in family photos obtained by the Fifth Estate, you can actually see what she's talking about. Jeffrey and his sister in front of that pig wall. According to the sister, they would spend hours here, confined to a rubber mat, unseen, unloved, and often unfed.
They ate table scraps, what was left over from the meals that the other 10 people in the home had. And they ate with their hands because the middle child had to be taught how to use a spoon and then fork, and eventually we started with plastic knives.
To the foster mother, it was clear Jeffrey's sister, too, had been severely malnourished.
She was very small. When they told me her age, I assumed it was a clerical error. She had sores on her legs, and her stomach was quite distended. And under the distension in her stomach, there was a line of ulcers and sores that were festering and oozing. Her feet were bright red.
And do you know why?
I believe it was the urine that would wash down upon their feet. And that had to have been painful with the open sores on them.
The little girl's explanation was almost more painful. She and Jeffrey couldn't use the toilet, she said, because every night and for much of each day they were locked in that second-floor bedroom. There was no heat. The vent had been shut off. The only window was covered. The other children went to school and were allowed outside to play. But she and Jeffrey were confined to their prison, let out only for what the adults called their exercise.
But not the way you and I would consider it okay to exercise children. They weren't running in the backyard or riding bikes or rollerblading or using scooters. They were walked back and forth in the kitchen with objects thrown at them if they stopped.
What went through your mind as you pieced this picture together?
Horror. Horror. I remember speaking to my husband and saying, you know, you couldn't make this nonsense up. Like, you couldn't. It was so surreal.
Surreal because the victims were so young and the abuse so inexplicably cruel. Deprived of food and even water, the children reverted to animal instinct, as the foster mother soon learned.
It was just after they arrived. I had set the middle child in to brush her teeth and to prepare for bed. And I turned back to view that child drinking from my toilet. I was horrified. I had never, ever expected to see a little child drinking like an animal. That was just an image that to this day still haunts me.
Soon the police began their own interviews. The children knew what was happening was wrong. According to Jeffrey's oldest sister, they also knew they had to keep it secret.
How come you weren't allowed to talk about Jeffrey at school?
I just wasn't thinking
they didn't want the children's aid coming and taking him away.
Why would children's aid come and take him away?
Because of the bad things that they were doing to us.
On a scale of 1 to 10, it was right up there at number 10.
What did you learn about what had happened and why it had happened?
I can't come up with any real reason other than these two children were targeted and they were hated by these grandparents for whatever reason and decided to treat them the way they did.
In the hopes and the expectation that they would die? Do you believe?
I can't see how anybody couldn't think that eventually that was going to happen in the condition of Jeffrey when he was found at the time of his death.
4 months after Jeffrey's death, his grandparents, Elva Bottineau and Norman Kidman, were arrested and charged with first-degree murder. Tragic though the case was, it appeared open and shut, and that might have been the end of it, if not for a startling revelation buried deep in Children's Aid's files. As Detective Mike Davis continued to investigate Jeffrey Baldwin's death, he wanted to know how Elva Bottineau got custody of her grandchildren in the first place. What was the role of the Catholic Children's Aid Society? He had just requested the Society's files when 2 CCAS workers showed up at his office.
They sat down and they just blurted out about these convictions of Elva Bottineau and Norman Kidman that were documented and were located within their files.
What the workers revealed was shocking. Jeffrey was not the first child to die in Elva's care. In 1970, a baby daughter died of pneumonia. When the autopsy found the baby had been battered, Elva was convicted of assault. The story had even made the papers, but despite that, 2 decades later, the CCAS helped Elva get custody of Jeffrey and his siblings.
I was blown away. I couldn't believe that a society that protects children could ultimately allow convicted child abusers to be given custody of children to care for them. I just couldn't believe it.
What Davis would soon learn was that Elva was only the half of it. After her first baby died, Elva had 2 more children, who she raised here in this apartment building with her new boyfriend, Norman Kidman. It took some digging. After all, 2 decades had passed. But we eventually found those 2 children and discovered another horrifying tale.
What happened to Jeffrey Baldwin, it turned out, had been rehearsed many years before.
As a child, I can remember being, stuffed into a dog cage. Me and my sister being put into a metal dog bin.
Fred Crota is Elva's son. His earliest memories are of abuse. It's all he and his sister ever knew, he says.
We were malnutritioned. We had, beatings, on us. We had marks on us, like marks on our bodies, from being tied to the bed with chains. Like there's just...
Tied to the bed with chains?
Yeah, like with dog chains. Like people who have guard dogs, like Rottweilers and Pit Bulls, the big thick chains. Well, that's what they used to tie around our ankles and around our stomachs and around our legs.
The chains were to keep them in their room, which meant they couldn't eat and they couldn't drink. When they did get out, like Jeffrey and his sister, they reverted to instinct.
It sounds gross, but I have to say it, but when they go to flush the toilet, there's clean water. We assumed was clean water. The toilet was never, all that clean, to be honest. But you take out what you could with your hand and drink it out of your hand.
2 sets of children, 2 decades apart. The common denominator, Elva Bottineau and Norman Kidman. If Mike Davis was shocked before, this was a stunner.
What happened to those kids and what happened to Jeffrey and his sister, it was like deja vu. It was the same thing. It was the same thing.
Not only the same thing, but the same Child Protection Agency. According to Fred, the CCAS was a regular presence in Elva and Norman's apartment. In particular, he remembers the family's caseworker, a woman named Helen.
She was there to watch on us, and, you know, on occasions where they would have coffee or whatever, and you could hear them arguing about her telling my mom, you've got to get this together, you've got to get your act together, and, you know, these kids have to, you know, get going.
So Helen was fully aware of what was happening to you guys in the house.
So she was quite understanding, like she knew what was going on.
She knew they were being beaten, he says, but there's no evidence Children's Aid did much about it. According to Fred, Helen's visits were just one more excuse for Elva and Norman's thrashings.
And the minute she was gone, the door would unlock, and we'd get beaten because she'd end up showing up because of us screaming or carrying on.
What would have happened to you, do you think, if you and your sister had not been taken out of that home?
To be honest, I probably, thinking back what happened to Jeffrey, I think we probably would have been in the same situation.
What saved them was the local school. Fred's sister showed up with bruises one day, and the CCAS was forced to act. The children were apprehended and put up for adoption. Norman Kidman was arrested and charged with assault. Now, you have to remember that back then things were different. Kidman pleaded guilty, but his fine was just $300. He was allowed to remain with the family, which by this point had grown to include 3 young daughters. In the meantime, the CCAS continued to monitor. As part of our investigation, we've learned details of what was in some of the agency's own files from the time. And like Mike Davis, we were shocked. In 1979, Elva Botno underwent a psychological assessment. In it, she admitted hitting her children. She was found to be incapable of coping with their demands. And according to the assessor, she was at times a danger to herself and to others. In other words, not someone you'd want taking care of kids. And yet that's exactly what Elva was doing. Not only did the CCAS not seize her 3 daughters, by the mid-1980s, the society was sponsoring Elva, paying her as a daycare provider. The woman who'd assaulted her first child, who had 2 more removed for their own protection, was now, according to the CCAS, fit to take care of other people's children.
It's just mind-boggling. I'm sure I'm sitting here shaking my head just as probably your audience is shaking their head right now.
Did anybody at Children's Aid offer you an explanation?
No.
And the CCAS wouldn't explain to us either. In fact, in the 3.5 years between Jeffrey's death and his grandparents' convictions, the Society has made only one public statement. Yes, Elva and Norman's information was in its files. Yes, it could have been checked. But no, it wasn't. Amazingly, the Society didn't even have a policy of doing criminal background checks when the caregivers were family. And it wasn't just once they failed to check, but each time Elva Botno got custody of one of her grandchildren. Yvonne Kidman and Richard Baldwin are the parents of those children. They've never spoken publicly, until now. As unbelievable as it may seem, Yvonne says it wasn't until the murder trial that she learned anything about her parents' abusive past.
As far as I know, my whole life is a lie. There's a lot of secrets. And so far with the court that's going on right now, the criminal court case, it's all coming out. And it's very shocking to me, I tell you one thing.
What she does know is that Children's Aid had a long involvement with her mother. As a child, social workers were in the house all the time, she says. At 16, when she became pregnant and moved in with Richard, the CCAS kept tabs on them, too.
It was hard because every day there'd be always somebody at the door. There'd be the Children's Aid walking in, or the health nurse walking in, somebody walking in that door. Every single day.
Why was that?
Just checking up.
People were worried about you.
Because we were young. I mean, we had arguments, we had fights.
The fights were how they lost their first child. In the middle of one argument, they left the baby unattended. A neighbor called Children's Aid, who decided the couple needed a break. and suggested Elva take the baby temporarily. Little did they know a process had begun.
And at the time you agreed that this would be a good thing for the baby?
We agreed on the fact that she would only stay for 6 months.
It's only supposed to be for a couple of days. Then they turned around and said, well, you guys still need more of a break. How will we put it over for 6 months?
And what happened after 6 months?
Well, it didn't even last 6 months. 2 months later, she went for custody.
She filed for custody.
So why would Elva want custody? Well, for one thing, it meant extra money. $125 a month in a household already dependent on social assistance. 3 years later, when Children's Aid decided to seize Jeffrey and his other sister, Yvonne had been seen shaking the little girl, Elva was back, this time even accompanying the social worker to the door. To Richard and Yvonne, it all felt like a setup.
They were there to help rent the kids.
They said that Yvonne was accused.
They didn't care what I had to say or what Richard had to say. They were there to take the kids.
They were waiting for something to happen to take these kids from us. They were just waiting.
Perhaps, but there's little doubt the parents needed help. Eventually, Elva got custody of all 4 of Richard and Yvonne's children. They say they didn't have a choice.
When somebody says to you, sir, we can either take your child right now, put it in society, have the child adopted out, you'll never see your child again. Or you could take your child, put it in with a family member, her mom, and you'd be able to see your child. And maybe down the road,
you'll have that chance of getting them back.
Have that chance of getting it back.
So you think that they manipulated you into this position? Is that really what you're saying here?
Yeah.
I feel like I've been manipulated.
But manipulated to what end? By the time Jeffrey and his sister were apprehended, Elva was clearly on a mission and had cultivated Catholic Children's Aid as an ally. While Richard and Yvonne struggled to get their lives back on track, Elva kept notes on them, secretly tape-recorded their phone calls, all in an effort to prove them unfit.
When your mother made application for custody of those 2 children, she described you, and she said you had a problem with drugs. She said that when you visited the children, you'd play psychological games. You would call them stupid, ugly, worthless. These were things that this is how she described you.
Oh, I'm sorry to say I have to say this, but that's bullshit.
Okay, no, don't use foul language, dear. You say it's BS. Be proper.
Well, it is. I'm sorry.
Say BS.
Yeah. Because it just keeps going on and on and on about all the things that she's been saying. And right now, I'm pretty pissed with her. I got a lot of questions I would like to ask her, but can't do them over the phone.
What do you want to ask her?
I like to ask her all kinds of stuff. Stuff like I heard that this was a huge and total scam.
What do you mean?
That my kids were a scam, just to get extra money from assistance.
Do you think that's true?
I don't know. But I would like to know the truth.
As dysfunctional as that home was, there was no shortage of eyes on Jeffrey Baldwin. In all, 12 people lived here, 6 of them adults. Experts who testified at the murder trial agreed his abuse must have started early. It's the only way to account for what he looked like when he died.
One could literally see every single bone in his body, and the bones were as if it were a skeleton. And I'd literally never seen anything like that before.
For Dr. Stanley Zlotkin, that's saying something. He's a nutrition specialist who spends much of his time in the third world, and yet the pictures of Jeffrey shocked even him.
This occurred over a long period of time. We're talking about years, and it was a severe deprivation, not a minor deprivation.
In other words, not something that could be easily overlooked. And yet Jeffrey's parents, who continued to visit their children at Elva's home, claimed they didn't see it, not at first. The kids seemed to be doing well.
The first couple of years they were thriving. I mean, they were happy, they were smiling.
Healthy?
They were healthy, they were playing, they talked.
When we went down there, they were fed because the food was all over them. It's like Mom would be, by the time we walked through the door, Mom would be cleaning them up from dinner.
So they looked well fed to you?
They looked well fed.
They appeared to be growing to you?
Yeah, except for Jeffrey, but everybody thought that Jeffrey was going to be short because there's a lot of short people in my family.
At least that's how Elva explained it, and Elva had an explanation for everything. Why Jeffrey didn't seem to gain weight, why he wasn't toilet trained. When Jeffrey's younger brother actually outgrew him, Elva argued it was the steroids in the baby's cream.
The cream was basically because he had that...
eczema.
Eczema.
Right.
So it had this special cream.
Steroid cream, yes, right.
Yeah.
This was the reason that Elva gave for the fact that he was so much bigger than his older brother.
And she would say, every kid's different. Some kids go up in weight, then they go down. And,
some are taller, some are shorter.
You know what? I don't feel comfortable. She goes, well, I'm on top of it. I'm making sure that they eat everything. I mean, what else were we supposed to do? I trust her.
And they continued to trust her, even when she banned them from going into the children's room. And even when they discovered that room was locked.
Elva came to me and said to us that they're drinking from the toilet. And I said, why are they drinking from the toilet? Are they not getting enough nourishments? Are they not getting enough water? She goes, yes, I give them water, but I don't give them water before bedtime because they wet the bed. And then they have to go through their whole routine in the morning.
So you knew they were drinking from the toilet?
I knew they were drinking from the toilet.
Didn't that cause you to be a little bit concerned?
We voiced concerns, but then all we get is arguments. And basically, if you don't like the way things look, leave.
It's the same ultimatum she apparently gave everyone else in the house, and it worked. None of the other adults, not Jeffrey's aunts nor their boyfriends, would talk to us about what happened. Although they did talk to police, and one of them, James Mills, did testify in court. He admitted he knew Jeffrey was in trouble. He described watching him a few nights before he died, crawling up the stairs, too weak to even walk. As Jeffrey spent his final hours in that locked room, Mills was next door playing video games. He heard coughing and sobbing. But rather than risk his free room and board, Mills did nothing.
Everybody knew what was going on in that house. They could see the condition of Jeffrey. They could see the way that he was being treated.
They weren't pretending that they didn't know in these interviews? No.
If I had the authority to lay a criminal charge against every other adult that was in that household at the time that Jeffrey was being starved, I wouldn't have hesitated to charge every single adult in that house. But unfortunately, there was no duty imposed on those people, which meant that there was no criminal offense being committed by those people.
But what about the duty imposed on the Catholic Children's Aid Society? Mike Davis was anxious to interview the caseworker who helped Elva get custody of the children. What did she know? Why didn't she at least check the Society's own files? But the CCAS was circling the wagons. The worker refused to talk unless Davis promised she wouldn't be charged. It's a deal he couldn't make.
She wouldn't talk to you?
Never did.
You surprised by that?
Very surprised.
Mm-hmm.
You should have cooperation in these joint investigations involving child abuse. And it didn't appear as if I was getting the full cooperation as I expected.
Davis wasn't the only one with questions. Several years before Jeffrey died, Fred Crota reestablished contact with his mother, looking for an explanation for his abuse. That's when he discovered Elva now had her grandchildren living with her.
She told me she had custody of all 4 kids. I'm like, how did you get custody of all 4 kids?
And you were surprised because...
Because of the fact that she actually got adoption of those kids. After all me and my sister went through, and this lady is still able to keep 3 kids, plus take on the adoption of the other 4 kids. I'm sorry, I don't have the highest grade in high school or the highest education, but it doesn't take a rocket scientist to figure that out. It's like there's something wrong.
Just how wrong was apparent the last time Fred saw Jeffrey.
His ribs would be all sunken, his arms were really thin and skinny. That triggered an alarm in me. I was like that.
You remember looking like that?
Oh, of course.
So when you saw Jeffrey and you had concerns, did you think maybe I should go to the authorities? Maybe I should go to Children's Aid? Maybe I should
warn them about this woman if they don't know?
I thought of it, but at the same point, it was the thing that kept coming back to me was that, look, she's got Children's Aid knows that they're here. Normally they do their checkups and whatever occasionally, you know. I don't know why they wouldn't have seen something like that happening. Maybe I should have said something or done something, but I didn't.
The experts who testified said that had Jeffrey got help, even a few weeks before he died, he could have been saved. But help never came. In the end, at the age of nearly 6, he weighed just 21 pounds, less than he had as a 1-year-old.
Have you seen the autopsy pictures?
No.
You don't know what he looked like?
No, I wasn't even allowed to even go in the room after he died.
All I knew is what he looked like a few months before he died. And basically, the way I looked at it is basically, like I said to Elva, I said, he looked like an Ethiopian child.
You said that to Elva?
Mm-hmm.
Did you ever think, Richard, that you had to take this beyond that house, that you should go to Children's Aid and say, look, I've been in there, I know they're drinking from the toilet, there's a lock on the door, my son's almost 6 years old, he's not at school because he hasn't been toilet trained, he's losing weight, he's not as tall even as his younger brother. Did any of that add up to you to a problem that you should have gone to the Children's Aid and complained about?
Who would have believed us? Who would have believed us? Look at all the accusations that are against us. Who would have believed us?
We were already deemed bad parents. I figured the Children's Aid were still looking in on them as far as I was concerned, and that I thought that I was told that Children's Aid were still coming in and checking up on her.
They may have thought that, but we found no evidence that Children's Aid actually was checking. Legally, they weren't required to, not when the first 3 grandkids went to live with Alva. But when she applied for custody of the youngest child, Jeffrey's brother, the CCAS did what's called a formal home study, an assessment of the house and of everyone in it, and apparently concluded things were fine.
There would be one more chance for Children's Aid to find out what was happening in that home. In the summer of 2000, 2 years before Jeffrey died, an allegation was made against Norman Kidman, an allegation of sexual abuse. A Children's Aid worker was sent to the house to investigate.
Did he see Jeffrey? Do you know?
He saw Jeffrey. He looked at Jeffrey. I believe he looked at one of the other siblings, if not 2 of the others. And at the end of the day concluded that everything was fine.
What the social worker didn't do, according to Davis, was the obvious. Take the time to walk up the stairs and look around.
Is it too much to say that that caseworker, had he done his job, might have saved Jeffrey?
The flag certainly would have gone up. I can't see how it couldn't. If you walk into a room that's in the condition that I had explained earlier about it, how could you not see that there was something drastically wrong here?
And why did he not? Do you know?
No explanation.
And no explanation either as to why, even at that point, when the allegation was sexual abuse, Children's Aid once again failed to uncover Norman's record. In the end, the verdict against Jeffrey's grandparents was second-degree murder. As barbaric as their actions were, the justice said, he could not conclude they intended Jeffrey to die. For police investigator Mike Davis, it was a bittersweet victory. Justice was served on the people who killed Jeffrey, but not on the agency he believes allowed it to happen, the Catholic Children's Aid Society.
There should be accountability here to a society that are the ultimate caregivers, child protectors of our children, and they're letting our children down.
But accountability is not something the CCAS is prepared to offer, at least not to us. In preparing our story, we had many conversations with the CCAS trying to arrange an interview. After weeks of negotiations, they finally agreed, but said they wouldn't talk until the murder trial was over. That was okay. We even changed our broadcast schedule to accommodate them. But then 2 days before the verdict, we got a fax. Everything was off. The CCAS had discovered how much we knew. We'd interviewed Jeffrey's parents about how they lost their children and had details about Elva and Norman's abusive past. Legally, they said, those were issues they couldn't discuss. So rather than answer any questions, the CCAS canceled. For a public agency that has a public duty, we didn't think that was good enough. So we went looking for the Society's executive director, Mary McConville. Miss McConville, good morning. Gillian Finley from the Fifth Estate.
Gillian?
How are you? As you know, we've been trying for months now to get answers from the Society about the placement of Jeffrey Baldwin, and we'd like to come and talk to you. We want to know why you won't agree to interview with us.
Gillian, you received a letter as to why I'm not doing the interview for the Fifth Estate.
I understand. We have received a letter. We're not asking you to divulge any identities. We're asking you to account for the actions of the Society.
The Society has accounted for its actions. We put out a statement on the weekend, or on Friday, I believe it was, which I think you've received.
The Society has never said why mistakes were made. You've never explained how this boy was put into the custody of people who had the potential to harm him.
Gillian, I'm not going to discuss this with you now. There is a statement which you're quite able to use.
That's not the same thing as accountability, Ms. McConville.
Excuse me.
You are a public agency.
Yes, we are.
You are publicly funded. Publicly funded to the tune of $88 million a year. We thought that should buy us a few more questions. Ms. McConville, as I say, you are a public agency. You are publicly funded. The public interest needs to know. How were mistakes made? Why were mistakes made?
Have you looked at the statement that was sent?
I have looked at the statement.
And are you telling me there's nothing in it?
I'm telling you that there's no explanation. There's an acknowledgement.
I believe there is an explanation.
Well, maybe you could tell us.
It does not go into the level of detail that I know that you would like and that your program has sought, but there is an explanation in the letter.
What is the explanation?
And I'm not prepared to discuss it any further.
Well, if it's as simple as that, surely you could just tell us what it is. The statement she refers to is in essence what the Society admitted before. Old records were simply not checked. Had they been, the statement says, we most certainly would have acted differently. As it is, the CCAS deeply regrets Jeffrey's tragic death. Knowing that we could have done more to prevent it has been heartbreaking to everyone involved. But for Ontario's Ombudsman, Andre Marin, sorry isn't good enough.
I want to know how it happened, why it happened, were there mechanisms that failed?
Thanks, Mr. Chairman, for you to...
For years now, Marin and his predecessors have been lobbying to get oversight of children's aid societies, to investigate the hundreds of complaints the Ombudsman receives every year. Marin hoped the sheer horror of the Baldwin case would help get children's aid societies on side.
You know, I thought initially when we were proposing this that I would see CISs lining up to support it. And so I've been astounded to a certain extent, but all I could say is that they don't want somebody questioning their decisions. But I think, you know, anyone who knows anything about the Jeffrey Baldwin case, it defies logic. That poor boy died a horrific death, and unfortunately, we have no answers to those questions.
Among the many sad things about Jeffrey Baldwin is the fact that in death, he proved far more important than he ever was to anyone in life. His siblings, his brother, and his 2 sisters are still in the CCAS's care. The caseworker who helped place them with Elva Botno is still in the Society's employ. As for Jeffrey's parents, they've since had another baby who was immediately seized by Children's Aid. Today, Yvonne Kidman and Richard Baldwin are fighting to get that child back. Fighting for what they call a second chance. A lot of people failed Jeffrey.
A lot.
And I'll be the first. I'll be the first to be honest. Yeah. I failed. I failed my son. It's hard for me to voice what I have to say because when it comes to that situation, that yes, I do feel guilty. I live with that guilt every single day, and I want everybody to know that I apologize. I let my son down, and
not even just him.
I let the rest of my children down.
Do you judge yourself? You don't. I mean, Richard says he lives with this every day. He feels guilt every day.
I do feel guilty every day. I see it every day. I hear of it every day. But, you know, like they say, the Jones, they always say to you, you know, you have to get on with your life. Well, how do you get on with your life when you're throwing it in when it's been thrown in your face every damn day of your life?
You've got so much anger built up in you, don't you?
A lot.
Who are you angry at, ultimately? Who are you angry at?
My mom, my dad, and the Jones Aid. There's a lot.